Hey, gang, this episode is sponsored by Fabric by Gerber Life. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. Now, remember, kids, they can't invest when they're minors. So an UGMA, a Uniform Gift to Minors Act account, this can allow you to invest on their behalf, but you can also teach them about investing and also give them plenty of time for that investment to grow. There are no contribution limits. There are multiple tax advantages, and they're SIPC insured up to $500,000. No commissions, just a low, flat monthly maintenance fee. So go to meetfabric.com/Jill and start investing in your child's future today. Welcome to Jill on Money, powered by the Compound. I am Jill Schlesinger, and I am so delighted to have a special guest. Something we don't usually do, which is I stole a guest from the boys from the Compound. Kyla Scanlon has written a book called In This Economy. Is that the right emphasis, Kyla?
Yes, that is right. Yeah.
Thank you. In This Economy. And this book, I want to be clear, Kyla. I read so many books like this, and I'm one of the few people who does a show like this who actually reads every book when I'm doing an
Yeah.
interview. Mark knows that I'm very compulsive about that, and they usually are, interesting, okay. Your book was fantastic. I was reading it over the weekend, and I turned to my wife and I'm like, this is such a great book. And like
Oh.
she, who hates anything that's like economics or finance, I made her read a few things. She's like, this is great.
Oh,
So
wow.
you have the Jackie and Jill seal of approval, which is
Um,
not really very common in my world. Okay.
yeah, that's awesome. I'm so glad to hear that. That's like
Yeah,
amazing.
it's totally awesome. So, I want to talk first about like a little bit about you,
Sure.
and so, how would you describe yourself in terms of like your training or your background? You wrote a book about the economy. Were
Yeah.
you an economics major?
Yeah. So I grew up in Kentucky and I went to Western Kentucky University full ride, like got super lucky with getting that. And when I got to school, I didn't even know that you could major in finance. Like I was going to be an engineer. But what was funny about that part of the journey is that I had been options trading in high school, but like didn't know that this was like a whole corporate life. And so once I realized that what I had been doing in high school was essentially a major, I switched over into econ and finance and data analytics. I kept a blog all throughout college called Scanlon on Stocks, where I talked about my options trading journey and all the money I lost. And then I went to work for Capital Group out in Los Angeles after I graduated. And so I have quite a bit of background in econ and in finance. And then have always just really loved explaining things. I've always wanted to be a teacher. And so I've kind of indirectly tried to do that through social media. And now I've had the wonderful opportunity to write this book and share it with people.
That's so awesome. Now, my first job on Wall Street, I was an options trader on the floor of the commodities exchange. I traded gold, silver, and copper options. And I
Wow.
loved when people like you were entering the options
Yeah,
market.
seriously.
That was the best ever. No, that's so
No,
mean to
it's true.
say,
No,
but that's
it's
like,
real. It's real.
so,
Yeah.
so why? So I did, of course I picked up on this. And so why did you trade options? I mean, how is it that you stumbled upon this? Did you know someone in an industry that would have introduced you to it? Like, how did this happen?
So my dad was doing this options trading journey through Tasty Trade, and I saw him doing it, and I was like, "What's going on there?" And he was like, "You're gonna have to learn it yourself." And I was like, "Okay, that sounds cool." And so I learned through this group called Tasty Trade, and then got like parental approval on my account. And then I I did paper trading as well. So I practiced a lot of things, and then I was always nervous when it came to real money, which is why I think I'm not an investor and instead talk about markets.
So when you were trading, so paper trading was always a fun thing because I'll tell you,
Yeah.
like when I started, we started out as clerks on the floor of the commodities exchange, and then we would all do paper trading. In other words, we would keep track. Like, here's the trade I would make if I were there right now. And then you'd be like, oh my God, look at how much money I would have made. And of course, there is a vast difference between putting something down on paper and having the feeling of either the euphoria of earning or making money or the agony of losing. And so the transition from paper trading to being a real trader is pretty important. So, what did you learn in the transition?
I learned that I am pretty risk averse, that I preferred paper trading. And for me, like it was just like, okay, like I don't really need to be trading options. Like I can just throw my money into an ETF and be okay. So that was like my path was realizing that that is not a lifestyle for me. And if it works for other people, that's great, but not for me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know what? It only took me 3.5 years to figure that out. You figured it out very quickly.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
so when you talk to people, and I'm not saying, I mean, it's weird. I feel like some people are like, she's the one to talk to young people. But
um,
no, this is for everybody.
Thanks.
What is the critical problem in the way that we're communicating economic information to the masses? I mean, this is really helpful to me because when I go on
Yeah.
CBS News and I'm talking to millions of people, what is it that we're getting wrong? What are people not understanding?
I spent an extraordinary amount of time thinking about this. So I travel quite a bit for work right now, and so I've been able to like go to a bunch of cities. Like I was just in DC, just in Miami, and I talked to a lot of people there. And like oftentimes they're not aware of certain policies that have been passed, or like they're not aware of like how inflation actually impacts them, other than like making things more expensive. And I don't know if it's like a foundational economic knowledge level. Like we don't really have required economics in school, and so it's kind of a lot to expect that people will
Mm.
understand econ without having access to the knowledge, which is like part of the reason that I wrote that book. Hopefully, anybody that wants it can understand it. But then I also think, like there is a little bit of confusion with media. Like media has a really hard job where they're trying to explain these huge economic concepts in the light of economic news. And that's really difficult. And then I think the third thing is economics is an incredibly personal experience, right? Like
Mm.
everybody has a personal inflation rate, everybody has a personal experience with the labor market. And so we oftentimes talk in aggregates and averages and medians. And for a regular person, they're like, but that's not my story. And so it's really tough because I think we're missing out on the foundational level of economics education. I think media sometimes can exacerbate issues that have existed since the beginning of time. And then I think number two, people struggle parsing things from averages.
Yeah, and I think that that's such a great point. So we're taping this. It's the day before the consumer price index will
Yeah.
be coming out. Okay.
Mm.
So I'm preparing a segment for TV. And the first question I have the anchor asking me, we'll see if they'll ask it. But the first question is, we're expecting this information to come out. First, can we just start? What is the difference between the inflation rate and prices? And
Yeah.
I do think that people don't live their lives remembering that before the pandemic, prices did go up every year, unless something horrible was happening. The prices went up every year. So, do you think that that's valuable just to reiterate where we have been? Or do you think people are like, I don't care where we were, I care where I am now?
Yeah, no, I don't think people care, but I think it's really valuable. I think that there's sort of almost a memory block from pre-pandemic times. Like people are like, "That's not real." I don't even remember what it was like before lockdown. But I think it
Mm.
is useful to like look back at that and be like, well, certain things are better. Like wages are growing, like inflation is going down, right? But yeah, I think people are very focused on the present moment, and then the other tough part about that is that people are more focused on the short term than the long term, right? And so, like, you could talk about things are trending in the right direction, but if they're not fixed by tomorrow, it's kind of like, well, why are you telling me about it? You
Right.
know? Yeah.
And also, as you said, it's like my personal experience. This would
Yeah.
always seem to come down to, well, I don't make that much money. So it's all well and good that like your stocks are up, but I don't have investments. And 3/4 of my income is going to cover these massive categories of, let's call it housing, transportation, and food. And so like stop talking about the interest rates or anything like that. Like how do you break through to someone like that to understand that all of this is interrelated? And as you say, it comes down to you because how we feel also can influence the economy, right?
Yeah, how people feel really matters, because it shapes their behaviors. Like expectations ultimately shape behavior. This is something I've had a lot of time spent thinking about. Like the first chapter of the book is around the economic kingdom, where I try to talk about the interrelatedness between inflation and the labor market and GDP and the Federal Reserve and fiscal policy and the dollar. But I think it's like very abstract. Like the economy is extremely abstract. There are a lot of moving pieces. Even as somebody who like thinks about it every day, I still am like, what's going on? And so I think it's just useful to reiterate like how the interconnectivity works. But yeah, most of the time people just they want to hear how it impacts them. And I think we've kind of left people to a disadvantaged point because the main way to build wealth in the US is through real estate, right? And so like when you're talking about the stock market as you were, and people not feeling like they're participating in that, it's like, well, why aren't they? Like how can we get more people involved in the stock market and not be reliant on the value of their home skyrocketing, right? I think there's like causes and symptoms that are difficult to address.
Do you think that the idea that how you feel and that how you may act around this, does it really influence the economy? And here's what I'm going to say. When I'm so old that, I used to have bosses who would say, I don't look at consumer sentiment. I could not care less. I only care what they do.
Sure.
And so when and I'm sure that, you can talk to a million people and we all complain about prices, but if we're still spending, regardless of the complaints, what use is it to really think about how we're feeling?
Yeah, I think that's been the big question. A lot of people have been like, people are spending a ton of money, but they're saying that they're feeling so bad. And I think now, like, we're starting to see delinquency rates begin to tick up. We're seeing savings begin to drop. And it's sort of like, I think sentiment is more of an indicator toward the future. Like, people are feeling bad, but they're still going to be spending money, at least in the short term. But in the long term, like, this sentiment downturn could be problematic. What's sort of funny about that, though, is that sentiment has ticked up at least a little bit. It's up, I think, 6% from this time last year, even considering the circumstances I just described. But I think it's just like the way that we oftentimes talk about the economy can sort of leave people out of it. Like we do talk about it in a really abstract way, like inflation is up and this is what's happening. And I think just storytelling is really important there, because I think how people feel does matter. And like the more stories that we can tell about how people feel, like hopefully that'll help them feel better. So it might not be a one-to-one relationship with like actual economic impact, but I think for the long term, it's really important.
So when you are the when you're doing all of the stuff that you put out there and you get responses to it, do people come after you when you say things like, "Well, the inflation rate is improving." They're like, "Ah, but prices are still high." Like, do people come after you to almost complain that not for me, or are they just thank you so much for explaining it?
Yeah. I mean, it's a mix of both. Yeah. So I'm for some people I am a projection of their imagination that they are going to lobby every insult at me possible.
How could they? You're so nice.
But
Come
well, I'm
on.
not real, I'm somebody on
Mm,
their screen.
right.
And so I just become like this figurative being that is telling them that things are good when maybe their circumstances are not. And so they're like, this person is lying, and I'm going to say horrible things to them. But then I have
Mhm.
people who are like, thank you for explaining what an inflation rate is and why that's different than price levels. So it's this, like the internet is a cesspool. It's
Mhm.
a
It
mix of both.
is. I
Yeah.
know, but I'm feeling very protective of you. Like, don't be mean to Kyla. She's awesome. If I'm because also I also feel like what happens in my world, again, like oldster world, like I'm an old certified financial planner and I've been doing this. So I will get a question from someone like a niece, nephew age person for me, which would be like your age. And they'll say, like, I saw something on TikTok. And I'm like, that's garbage. Like that's my first reaction. But I do think that it's very hard to parse out the Kylas and the Jills, if I may put myself in your camp,
Sure.
from other people who are saying trash on social media, but that people are consuming that trash. I don't know
Yeah.
how to break through that.
Yeah, you can't, right? There's it's really difficult because like the way to go viral is to like lie and to say extremist things and to be like, BlackRock is going to eat your family in the middle of the night. Like that's like how you go viral on TikTok.
Right.
Because we're humans, and so our human brains are like, oh my gosh, I have to protect myself against this. Like BlackRock's going to eat my family, and so it's much easier to game the algorithm that way. If you're telling the truth about things and if you're just trying to explain things in objective, like nuanced manner, that doesn't always go as far. And so you're just competing against, the human bias, but then you're also competing against everything in the world ever, which is like everything on media. And yeah, the algorithms are just they're rage bait.
So, what let's do something fun.
Sure.
If the old-fashioned way of defining the American dream is that, okay, everyone gets married and has 2.2 kids, lives in a house, has a car, maybe 2 cars, da 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 da. What's the new American dream? What should it be? How do you think, 20, 30 somethings, what is that dream, do you think?
Is this fun? Like,
Fun. You do whatever you wanna
like
do, like, just whatever like, what's the great like, the American dream always centered on, like, this
the
rigid
nuclear family.
right,
Yeah.
but, like, just this rigid definition. What
Mhm.
should a new definition of the American dream be?
Yeah, I mean, I think like what I'm seeing from people around my age, so like mid to late 20s, who are sort of inheriting the American dream is like a desire to travel, like going and seeing other parts of the world, going beyond just your four corners. I think that there's a desire to save money. There's also a desire to like not wait for retirement. So like the American dream is probably accumulating enough wealth in the near term that you can like spend in the near term. Like you're not constantly working. There's a little bit more flexibility between work and life. And you're able to travel, spend time with friends, whatever. It's interesting because I think the American dream is becoming more individualistic, which I don't know if it's a good or bad thing. It's just a thing. Like I don't I think that the children are part of some people's American dream, but people aren't having kids at the rate that they used to. They're not getting married at the rate that they used to, but they are traveling, right? Like they are trying to spend time with friends. They're like joining run clubs to find community. And so I think it's yeah, like it's sort of the hero's journey has become the American dream.
And it doesn't have to be that you own a home. I mean, this is the other part of
No,
it, which
yeah,
is like you put that pressure on yourself
yeah,
if you've gotten that messaging.
mhm,
We hear so many times from like on our podcast, we get people who come on the air with us and we just talk about we like spitball their financial lives. Okay. And so many people are like, well, I'm trying to buy a house. And I'm like, don't try so hard. It's not
yeah,
okay. It's okay. Like you don't have to own a home to be successful. And also, as you said, you can redefine what your life is like. We
yeah,
just got off the air with somebody. Mark and I just did had a conversation with somebody, and we were laughing so hard because, like, we read an email that this guy's like, "I have $1.5 million. I'm 36 years old. I live horribly. Like, I have roommates still. I'm 36. I have $1.5 million. I have roommates. I don't do anything fun." And like, he can't give himself permission to have
yeah,
balance because he's so hyper focused on like I want to be at this place by this time. And I love the idea of balance. I really do. I think it's like
yeah,
it feels like a more sustainable path, I guess.
yeah.
And that's what I would hope for. I'm wondering if all of the things that we think are happening now as a result, right? We've just come out of COVID. It still is early days. That, are you more in the camp of, you know what? Life regresses to the mean. We'll get back to where we were. Or do you think something substantial has really changed for a generation of people who come of age amid the COVID era?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that there's an immense amount of uncertainty right now, just politically, like what that could mean. I also think the state of work is changing, like, AI and what that could do. That'll probably change the American dream to a certain extent. I think I wrote a piece for Fast Company a year ago talking about like how Gen Z works, and the big idea was that work is changing and like the American dream is changing, and this is probably a moment of change. And like there's always a internal part of you that's like, oh, things sort of stay the same forever, right? But I do think that post COVID, post Great Recession, post internet bubble, there is an inherent amount of distrust, a lot of nihilism, and that is potentially going to result in a quote unquote rebellion from traditional institution.
Um, you end the book. It's your last line of the book, which I highlighted. People are the economy, so let's make the economy about people. What do you mean by that?
It's sort of what we were talking about earlier, like how people feel really matters. I think that as I said, we talk about the economy in abstract terms, and we don't oftentimes center people in these economic conversations. Some people do, but like not a lot of people. And I think that the more that we can remember that like workers are the economy, that like working parents, like parents in general, just sort of kids, like human capital is the most prominent in a child, which sounds really creepy to say, but it's true. It's like I think that we just have to refocus on a component of our economy that we've ignored for a long time, which is people. Like wage growth was stagnant up into the pandemic, which is kind of bizarre considering how much people actually work and do for the world. And I think we've over financialized certain aspects of the stock market, which bleeds into the economy. And I just think it's very idealistic, and I worry that I sound Pollyanna with it sometimes. But I just think the more that we can focus on people, ideally, the better economic circumstances we can end up with.
But, and the other part of this, I remember one of my first interviews with an economist, Diane Swank.
Oh,
I
she's
would
the
say,
best.
isn't
Yeah.
she awesome?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I said, we were like in the studio, and I'm like, why do you do this? Like
Yeah.
this thing called economics. She says, look, I got into economics because I love the idea that we could craft public policy to help people. And she said, and then all of a sudden it became like just talking about stuff in the economy to help shareholders. And
Yeah.
she said, and like, that's not why I got into this.
Right.
And I think that there's we have a misstep, and there's like a missing piece that like part of the whole practice or science, soft science of economics was to say, how do we craft policy to help the people who build the economy? And I do think that oftentimes, if you turn on financial media, we lose that piece. We
Yeah.
just absolutely lose it. So let's go back in time for a second. Let's go all the way back to 2020 and 2021. And if you look at the policy and the economics of the decisions that were made, which were made in like, come on, gang, let's just be honest. It was a once in a century pandemic. We did not know what was going to happen. So the idea that two different administrations said, let's pour money into people's pockets, the economy is frozen. In retrospect, was that the right, if you were going to make an error, was that the right error to make, or would the right error maybe have been give a little bit less money, risk that it took longer to get out of a rut, more people might have suffered, but we wouldn't have as much inflation?
I mean, what's this is like a weird thing to say, but like COVID was the greatest natural experiment that we could have asked for. Obviously, like it came with great tragedy, but you can actually look over to Europe and see what would have happened if we hadn't given out the checks that we'd given. You'd still end up with inflation, but you'd end up with an economy that can't fix the inflation because people are in such dire straits. Europe has its own set of issues and have had issues for a long time, but I think the United States saved itself because of fiscal policy. And a lot of people don't like, the government spending. They're like, oh my gosh, why would the government spend money when I pay taxes? Like it's like that's why that's why you pay taxes. But I think that it was one of the best things that we could have done because it was such a time of uncertainty for people. Just knowing that they were safe, I think, actually prevented further issues. I think we still have a social unstructuring that's going on, but that's more from a ideology angle versus a desperation angle.
What do you mean by that social unstructuring?
I think we have ideology beginning to drive people into polarizing corners, and I worry
Mm.
that there's no reseeming that. Yeah.
That's why we have you guys. You're the 20 somethings. You guys are going to do that for us. I feel very confident in that. If you wanted to look back on that time in like the social experiment part, do you think that again the work changing, it feels like there's still like a generation gap in that respect as well? Like I was just laughing. I was talking to a friend of mine who is a doctor. And he's like, I'm commuting 5 days a week. And all my friends who work on Wall Street, they're in like 3 days a week, but they're the same people who are pounding on the table saying, our workers have to be in 5 days a week. Like, why are people so struck by the fact that we don't want to be in an office 5 days a week? That's number one. And number two, is that do you sense that from people who are in their 20s or 30s, people who are your viewers, your audience, that they get something out of being in an office? Like there is mentorship, there's like even collegialness with like having friends in the office. Like my friends like, I don't want to be on social apps. I want to just like meet someone in the office. I'm like, okay, well, you got to go in then.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so I graduated basically into the pandemic, so I didn't really have a regular work experience. I was in office for a couple months, and then the pandemic happened, and I've never been back.
Hmm.
And I think for me, like that's okay. But I think for a lot of people, there it is. If you're working from home, you just miss out on the mentorship, and you miss out on leadership. You miss out on the subtleties of how to like talk to people in a corporate way. That was something I spent a lot of time learning about when I first joined, and I was in the office for just a couple months. Is like it's a totally different language, and you only kind of learn it when you're around those people. And so I do think that the younger generation misses having that opportunity
Mm.
to have the older generation invest in them. And I think there's actually been a lot of issues with the older generation, some parts of it, like refusing to invest in younger people. That's been a trend that I've noticed. And so I think that there is a lot of benefits to return to office, but like, of course, people don't want to go back. Like, liminal lighting is one of the worst things we've ever done. Offices, the open office space concept, there's studies coming out that it's terrible. Like,
No kidding. I mean, oh my
yeah,
God. I mean, if you work in a newsroom, Mark and
yeah,
I like have
yeah,
worked in
yeah,
newsrooms and it's like
yeah,
it's open and like you hear people like having very personal, but also like you want to have like a conversation with someone you're interviewing and it's like you hear
yeah,
someone shrieking in the background and it's not good. It's not
right,
good. Like your crap is bleeding out all over the place. Not good for anybody,
yeah,
frankly. I'm sort of like a door is a good thing. Like it's
yeah.
very nice thing. What do you think that we need to focus on as good members of the economy? If you want to focus on a few data points, what are your what are your biggies that you really think people should understand that they should just get their arms around just to make them feel like at least more connected to the economy in a real way?
I think that understanding inflation and like understanding deflation and that there's a difference between the two is really important. I think a lot of times people hear inflation is going down and, they're like prices are still expensive. Like there's, number one, issue with rates and levels there, but then there's also an issue with like deflation versus inflation and disinflation. So I think that's kind of a good place for people to start. I also think just revisiting supply and demand is really important. I think that that's oftentimes something that people struggle a little bit with. You can look at like the advocation for price controls is one example of, a lesson on supply and demand might be pretty good there. And so I would say that's a good one. And then I think just the understanding the labor force and like the
Mhm.
cyclicality of it is key. Like, tech and finance were in recessions, but like hospitality and healthcare weren't. And what does that mean for like your career prospects? That is key as well. Yeah.
I loved your when just going back to supply and demand. Like a year ago, I came off the set and one of the producers was like, why are prices at restaurants so high? And I looked at him and I said, because you keep eating out.
Yeah, right.
That's why.
Yeah.
Stop it. Just
Yeah.
stop.
Yeah.
And then that was such a weird part. I mean, talk about the experiment of confining people for 12, 24 months and then unleashing the desire to be human beings and go out and have fun. And, all of that being said, at some point you look at a menu and you're like, this is dumb. I don't care what's happening in the economy. I'm not eating out as much.
Yeah.
But that took a way longer time, I think, than we would have thought.
Yeah.
I think people are pulling back a little bit more. I mean, look, maybe if you're rich and you're going out to dinner, you don't care. But even rich people I know who are like, you know what? I don't even really feel good about a $40 entree. That's not making me happy. So I need to do something else. Or I'm going to cook at home.
Yeah.
And doesn't mean it's cheap, but it's certainly cheaper.
Right.
And so that's the idea of supply, demand, and prices. So, Kyla, is there a last word that you want to leave us with about in this economy or about anything else that's going on that you want to tell people? Give us a good, optimistic, hopeful message to end.
One of my favorite quotes is from James Baldwin, and it's a paraphrase, but essentially the idea is that everything that we've ever lived through, somebody's written about it before. No story is truly unique. And I really like that because I think in times of immense uncertainty, if you can look to literature and if you can look to art for hope, I think it's one of the most beautiful things that we can do, because not only does it reconnect us with other humans, but it also can reconnect us with ourselves. And so that's what I would leave you with is there is still hope out there.
Thank you so much. Kyla Scanlon joining us today. And thank you so much. And go check out her book, In This Economy, and check out all of her stuff on social. What's your handle?
I'm at Kyla Scan. So KYLASCAN.
So great. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks so much for watching. Please leave us comments, rate, review, whatever. Do all that good stuff. Send us notes. Go to jillonmoney.com. Click the contact us button if you have questions. And we'll talk to you next time. Thanks.